Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special edition of ASCE Interchange Live, the series where you hear from difference makers in and around the civil engineering community. I'm Brad Keeler, a managing director at the American Society of Civil Engineers. If you don't know anything about ASCE, after you watch this amazing interview today, head over to asce.org, and there you will find out all kinds of things about us, including that we're the world's #1 technical society in civil engineering. We have about 165,000 members, and we would love to have you as one of them. If you are not currently a member, you can find out more about that again at asce.org. If you like what you see today, and I am positive that you will, be sure to like this post, repost it, share with friends and colleagues, and so on and so on. Today on Interchange, our guest is Jake Bittle, senior staff writer at Grist and author of the 2023 book, The Great Displacement, among other things, articles, books that he's written. He's also a keynote speaker at ASCE 2027, coming up next March in Philadelphia. It's the Society's premier event, uniting infrastructure and civil engineering leaders to explore bold ideas, innovative solutions, and the future of the profession. And if that didn't sell it, this series highlights its vision and strategy sessions, key themes, and keynote voices. Jake's keynote and our conversation today will focus on the climate crisis and the need to invest in both clean energy and resilient infrastructure. Coming to us from close to the left coast of America, it is Jake Bittle. Jake, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, and you sold that well.
Yeah, I've been doing it a long time. You get in a groove and then you just go with it. We've got several questions for you today. We're going to talk a little bit about the book, but we're going to talk more generally about the themes that you are now an expert writer in general. And kind of broadly, it falls under that climate change umbrella. You are a journalist. You're not a scientist. You're not an engineer. Other than being a human being on Earth, why did you start caring about issues like climate and sustainability?
Yeah, and everything I say comes with the caveat that I am not an engineer, certainly. I mean, yeah, I knew I always wanted to be a journalist, and most of my initial work, like coming out of school, was about housing and urban development, and more, like in New York, where I was living at the time, and then I did some work in Texas as well. I started to hear a lot about how, sort of repetitive, natural disasters were sort of stressing the urban fabric. And there were a lot of assumptions about, the lifespan of a certain, residential community, or the capacity of a storm drain, or, the resilience of a beachfront area that were being, if not completely upended, then stressed, certainly. And I think that, experience sort of writing about housing displacement, urban development, and their connection with extreme weather kind of led me almost through the back door. Like, a lot of people get into this work because they have a deep connection to the environment, and I love the environment, of course, but it was sort of through that route of like a lot of writing about urban issues and housing that I then sort of started to work on stuff about just climate science, and then about energy, and now sort of my coverage sort of runs that whole gamut.
Which is great, because sometimes when you come at these issues from a different perspective, you do have those insights. You're able to pair things together, like the housing component to this, that maybe if you were too into the science, you wouldn't see. So one aspect of this, I think, is financing. Your keynote's going to talk a little bit, or maybe a lot, about that. And I think the way we've got this question worded is who pays? And so I want to talk about that for a minute. Your keynote takes directly on that question, who pays when it comes to climate change investment? And the second half of this, I guess, is who's facing the greatest funding pressures, and what does that mean for those people or those communities?
Yeah, I mean, you can broadly think about this in a few different buckets, right? Like, one major bucket is like, just the homeowner themselves, or whoever, is like the taxpayer. If your town gets destroyed by some kind of disaster, like, you have to pay a lot of money. Another portion of it comes from the insurance companies, who are on the hook for like quite a bit of residential damage and repair of property. And then the third is the government. So, that sounds kind of clean, like, okay, the private sector, the insurance companies, and the government, but there's a lot of places where I think like a lot of stuff falls through gaps between those. And I think probably the best example and the easiest to understand is like you know, a lot of smaller communities, rural areas, like they have very little money of their own. You know, their tax bases are really stressed. A lot of times they're declining. And so almost all of the recovery money, you know, following a flood or something like that is supposed to come from the federal government. But a lot of times the community is too small to secure that money, or it doesn't have the person who can write the grant to get the grant funding, you know, that can help them create like a more resilient streetscape or something like that. So I think those places, you know, they end up shouldering a lot of that burden themselves. You know, then they have to raise taxes or borrow money, and then that can sort of cause like a sort of downward cycle later on. I think, you know, individual homeowners sort of have the same thing, where if they're underinsured, you know, or if they don't have enough money to shoulder the cost of a rebuild themselves, then they end up paying as well.
So it didn't take you long, as you listed those three groups, to connect the insurance companies and the government to individual people. And I think, especially when you wrote The Great Displacement, right, there was a collection of stories, essentially. It's about people and how this influences them. I think it's really easy for those individuals, again, to look at government, to look at insurance companies as these big nameless, faceless things, when really they aren't. A lot of the work that they're doing is based on the actions of individuals that then go back and create the policy for those people. I mean, how have you wrapped your brain around that all of these things really come back to the actions of individuals?
Yeah, I one of the early chapters in the book is about a town in North Carolina where it was like one of the first towns to use federal money to buy out like a whole neighborhood, which had been repetitively flooded. And, you know, this is a well-known program, like among experts. It's like been used, you know, tens of thousands of times in the US. But, you know, the guy who administered it, like, it was just like a guy in North Carolina. You know, he was the first person ever to receive this money. And so a lot of people really didn't like the way you know, this was an African-American community. It was a predominantly white town. There was a lot of difficulty in the way that this was handled. But when I tracked him down, you know, he had retired. And I was like talking about it. He's like, I really didn't know what was going on. You know, I was the first person ever to do this. So, you know, I think that, you know, a lot of times, like, yeah, I mean, it brought home to me, you know, the importance of kind of like what we often call like institutional knowledge, and just kind of developing like sort of an expertise in case studies and learning from, you know, the way these things are implemented. Because, you know, one thing that's common across all sectors of the kind of climate conversation is that like abstract principles and like policies that sound really good. And then like when you try to actually implement them, there's just myriad challenges just because of the complexity of the built environment and the energy system.
And those policies are often really far removed from the individuals that they impact. I think back to a lot of debate around clean coal 15, 20 years ago, and the people creating the policies about that and carbon offsets and all the stuff that kind of surrounded it were often in parts of the country where there was nobody burning coal. Coal was not used to create energy in those areas, and there was a big disconnect. I want to talk a little bit about that disconnect now. And again, with those nameless, faceless entities, I think in the past it was easy for a lot of individuals to just kind of say that they were going to sit this out, that this was not something they needed to worry about. I mean, I would argue that we had passed that point 20 years ago, but we're definitely past it now, especially for somebody who works in these communities that ASCE is talking to. For somebody who works in civil engineering or infrastructure who's uncertain about how climate change is going to reshape their industry, why is this something they should not just sit on the sidelines for?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy for me to say, you know, because it's what I write about, that it's really important. But I do think that there's like significant tail risks in not understanding, you know, the potential dynamics. And like, I'll just give like, you know, two obvious examples. Like one is like, you know, the power grid for a long time was kind of like a pretty dry topic. I mean, nobody really paid much attention to it. You know, PJM, the big interconnect in the Northeast, was kind of like this thing that like even climate reporters didn't really know about. And now like this is, such an integral part of the conversation around data centers and leveraging money for infrastructure investment on the grid, and not understanding how those systems work, kind of leaves you a little bit maybe being left behind by the conversation. And then the other thing is that, when we talk about like sea level rise planning, for residential infrastructure, or, like a beachfront community, those projections about sea level rise are projections. And in some cases they've come in, actual sea level rise has come in below projection. But in other cases, like depending on what happens with certain like Antarctic ice sheets, it could come in well above those projections, and they're stochastic. Like they're like that event, like sea level rise, is not linear. So I think like whether or not, you feel that there's an urgent need, to incorporate, adders and riders on climate change in every, piece of civil infrastructure, which there may not be in every community right now. There's certainly like a tail risk that at some point, this is going to become not just like a sort of 10% on the top, but change the way that you have to think about, sort of fundamentals of the built environment, I think.
So as you've done this work, I mean, you've written a lot about these topics now at these points, and you've talked to a lot of different people in a lot of different communities. Even you can get down to those local government planners that you mentioned earlier. I think they're probably a fascinating insight into this whole world. Why is it so important to get everybody together and maybe even bring in other players who haven't traditionally been part of these conversations?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we were saying about the implementation of some of this stuff. I mean, like, for instance, we can talk about this in a second, but I'm in Bakersfield in California right now working on the second book project. And, the Biden administration had like significant grants through a program called the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration to fund carbon capture here, basically to sequester carbon in old oil fields. And this was like a, serious potential like economic development opportunity for this place. But, it implicates so many different institutions, right? Like the trade unions, the community college district had to train people how to do this, the oil company, right? The California Air Resources Board, the climate regulator, the local planning office here, the, PG&E, the utility, the people who, have the building trades, right? They have to design this stuff. Like, it's impossible, and that program was sort of a top-down program. It began with like an idea that was part of the Inflation Reduction Act. This was just like a legislator's idea for how we could, transition away from fossil fuels in this country. But, just to be able to do even one project, if any of those stakeholders was missing, there's a serious conceptual flaw, that each of them, probably could have pointed out, or a different, potential shortcoming or, tail risk. So I think like, honestly, a big problem with the way that we've done, both adaptation and mitigation policy in this country and others is that there's been a kind of like a lack of like omnivorous. There needs to be more of an omnivorous tendency. Like you should be incorporating expertise from all areas.
Which I think a good place to go after that answer is to talk about some of the specific technologies that you've seen. Yeah. For a long time, I think it was a little bit of a flavor of the month approach where something would get really hot and then either the government would change or the funding priorities of the federal agencies would change and it would kind of go away. Biochar, I think, is a good example of something that was really hot for a while and then it kind of tailed off. Sequestration, I think, is a better example of something that has stood the test of time now. This technology is matured and it's being used in ways that we didn't think of 25 years ago. Yeah. What are the most exciting innovations that you've seen as you've gone through all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people would still say that carbon capture it's still an area of very active debate, which is fun for me. But I think like on the energy side, I mean, geothermal has proven to be pretty there seems to be, is pretty strong evidence it can be cost effective at scale. But I think what you're saying is even more applicable to the resilience side, which is like where I think, civil engineering is even more integral. For a long time when we did, adaptation planning in this country, like the main vehicle for it was the Army Corps of Engineers, and their main proposal, like people probably heard about the Ike Dike, right? The big massive storm gate in Houston along the Galveston Ship Channel. They had planned a series of these, up and down the East Coast. The one in New York, where I usually live, is like $50 to $60 billion. And I think because of the difficulty with executing those capital projects, there's been a lot more emphasis on other lower impact ways to change the built environment. There's an institute called the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety that has developed relatively affordable standards to retrofit homes for wind damage and fire risk that maybe cost $20,000 for the average home. Like, this is very different from $50 billion. There's a lot of stuff about it's a little gimmicky, but like sponge cities and sort of like absorbent streets that, this is a really, really effective way to like reduce localized flooding. And I think that, for the people who suffer in these events, like they don't really care how ambitious or unambitious the solution is. And an individual rainstorm that floods their basement is like as scary to them as $100 billion hurricane that we planned for. So I think, the kind of approach to, working with the environment we have and, sort of starting from what the vulnerabilities actually are has proven, I think, like relatively high impact relative to the cost, which is always the big concern.
You walked right into one of my follow-up questions for that one then. As you've gotten out and talked to all these people, I mean, what do you think people's tolerance is for these events? And has it changed over time? You look at things like the space program, right? We are not tolerant in the United States of any mishaps in space. If one person dies, it's too much. And it's a very dangerous environment. Do you think people's tolerance for extreme events and weather and climate has changed over the years?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, some people have like they if they're really attached to the place that they live, they're gonna be willing to stay there despite repetitive disaster events. And then some people, if they have a flood one time, like they're done. Like I met a woman who moved to Tucson after she was flooded once. I mean, she just said like, I'm not doing that again. I don't care how hot it is there. I think what's an even more interesting kind of like thread in that question is how much patience we have with the government when it comes to preventing, the catastrophic impacts of these disasters. And that too is kind of ambiguous. I mean, I think that like FEMA, it has a kind of mixed reputation. I mean, people think of it as like being, slow, et cetera. They messed up during Katrina, et cetera, et cetera. But, then it also enjoys like pretty significant support among the American population, among both parties, because people understand that the government, they may not do it well all the time, but like there's no other entity that can step in and fill that void. That's a very interesting question.
It's the worst agency on earth until it's there to help you. And then suddenly things change a little bit. Right. I do want to talk a little bit about maybe not just the regulatory climate, but legislative also. People are often really cynical about this, and it does. If you're outside the Beltway, I get this. It looks like it takes a long, long time to get anything done. Yeah. With those constraints in mind, I mean, what examples do you feel like we can trumpet as real progress to address climate and resilience issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that while the two federal bills under the Biden administration were enormously impactful on like the investment landscape, and there has been like some really, really significant, energy development as a result of those bills and the subsidies associated with them. I think like a lot of states have done really, really impressive jobs with, finding ways to finance resilience. Like Alabama, for instance, has a kind of like very bipartisan, support for what they call fortified homes, which is the standard that I was talking about earlier. They, rolled out a tax credit for like, I think a couple maybe tens of thousands of these homes along the coast. And there's, clear evidence that reduced, the risk landscape for future hurricanes. I think the other thing, and this is a little bit controversial, but I think that there's a big question about how to like leverage money for, really large scale grid upgrades. And while the data center build out, I certainly wouldn't say that it's been net good for climate change. There are examples like Alphabet, for instance, has this deal in Minnesota where, they'll build a data center and they'll, leverage close to $1 billion, I think, for, something like a gigawatt of wind, which is comparable to any of the big offshore wind farms, transmission upgrades, right? And then ratepayer protection. So there may be opportunities for settlements kind of between the private sector, the government, the utilities, to find ways of unlocking like really, really large amounts of money. But it would help to have a more present federal government. But a lot of the states have really like innovated on the policy side.
I'm going to wrap up here talking a little bit about a project you're working on now. We mentioned that you're out west, you're in Bakersfield, and you're writing a book about Kern County, California, the home of Bakersfield, California. Can you go into some of the details about some of the challenges that you're seeing out there that Kern County is facing, and how those are like a microcosm of what the United States or North America is facing at large, especially in these climate and infrastructure resilience?
Yeah, I mean, this is a place that the two main industries are oil and agriculture. And, they've been sort of asked or forced by the state of California to really reduce those because of water concerns, and then also because of the state's climate mandates. And I think that there's a number of people here in the county who've been really forward-looking about trying to find a way to develop renewable energy or logistics, or just kind of, economic diversification, find new ways to finance even just like routine infrastructure improvements without oil money. So it's kind of it's a case study of like the 20th century economy and how the difficulties of like pushing that into the 21st century. It implicates a lot of the stuff that we've talked about.
And Kern County, massive. If anybody has ever looked at a map, if you have not looked at a map, go check it out. It's enormous. It's one of the 20 biggest counties in America. And the development there is fascinating. You go all the way from suburban or heavily suburban in the east to essentially desert in the northeastern part of the county. And I mean, we could have a 5-hour conversation just about that. Can you give people a time frame for when this is going to be out in case they're now looking forward to it?
I wish I could say that it would be out at the 2027 meeting, but it'll probably be out about a year from now. I'm going to finish it right after this call.
Fantastic. Jake, you made it through all the questions. You survived. I wasn't going to hit you with anything too crazy, but it's still a feat anyway. We still appreciate it. I think we'll call out for everybody again to join us, Jake and me, in Philadelphia for ASCE 2027 next March. Registration for the event will open over the summer, and you can learn more by visiting experience.asce.org. I also want to remind you that this is the first in a series of special interchange episodes focused on speakers and themes around ASCE 2027. We're going to be back with you next month with Jared Green, an ASCE board member, geotechnical engineer, and Philadelphian. So you can look forward to that. Jake, thanks for being with us today and giving us all this insight on your keynote, your background, and some of the work that you've done.
Thanks so much for having me. It was awesome.
Thanks again to all our viewers today. If you liked what you saw, be sure to like, repost, recommend it to your friends and colleagues. For more information on the Interchange series, visit asce.org/interchange. Our producer today was Samantha Rose Hall. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time on ASCE's Interchange Live.